Good morning, everyone. My name is Mansi Narula, and I'm here on behalf of the International Law and Policy Society of National Law University, Odisha. I would like to warmly welcome you all to the second episode of Borders and Beyond. Today, we are truly honored to have with us Dr. Usha Natarajan. She is an honorary fellow and senior lecturer, Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies, Law and Political Economy Faculty Fellow at Yale Law School, Senior Fellow at Melbourne Law School, and the Visiting Professor at Geneva Graduate Institute. From 2020 to 2023, she was Edward W. Said Fellow at Columbia University. She has held fellowships at McGill University, York University, the University of British Columbia, and Dalhousie University. She received her PhD in international law from the Australian National University. Prior to academia, she has worked with international organizations in Asia and Pacific, including the United Nations, UNDP, UNESCO, and the World Bank. Natarajan's research is interdisciplinary, utilizing post-colonial and third world approaches to international law to provide an interrelated understanding of development, environment, migration, and conflict. Her research has been recognized by global awards and grants in international environmental law, migration and refugee law, and post-colonialism. From the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Harvard Law School. With over 50 publications, she is a founding editor of the Third World Approaches to International Law Review and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment and the Journal of Environmental Law and Practice. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Uchu, who will tell us more about the article we'll be discussing in today's podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. We were specifically intrigued by your paper, Colonialism, Jurisdiction and Sovereignty in Palestine. And we just give a brief of this paper before we get into the set of questionings. So everyone listening to this podcast has an idea of what we are discussing primarily. Ma'am, in her paper has argued that international law reproduces colonial violence. She analyzes the Israeli occupation and the genocide of Palestine in this paper and argues first that the concept of sovereignty is Western and colonial, with Palestine receiving conditional sovereignty at the best, which is also decided by Israel. This includes a delegation of power to Palestine, where Israel decides everything from the time and scope of occupation to when Palestine is supposed to be subject to a blockade and when Palestine is supposed to be subject to genocide. Ma'am then argues that Israel, like colonial states, view jurisdiction in a very convenient manner, that it exercises complete legal and judicial power over Palestine. But the moment the question of Hamas pops up, Hamas becomes an enemy state or an extrajudicial character, and they use this to justify disproportionate acts of self defense, which is often preemptive in nature. Israel also upholds an apartheid legal system, which has different regimes existing for Jewish and non Jewish or Palestinian people. Ma'am also argues that despite the existence of ERGOM's obligations and universal jurisdiction, powerful states like the United States of America have utilized international structures to uphold this violence which Israel metes out and shields them from any accountability. Through this podcast episode, we aim to discuss in detail these specific ideas in the context of the legal and political developments which have taken place in Gaza over the past year. Mansi, throw it back to you.
Now, I just want to start with the first question that you argue in your article that Palestinian colonialism is not just a part of its history, but a defining feature of its current reality. How do you see colonialism structuring Palestine's struggle today as well?
Well, first of all, thank you for your lovely introduction, Mansi, and for your really helpful overview, Jan, of the article. I'm very happy to discuss this with you, and I really appreciate your decision to pay attention to Palestine, and I hope Palestine is discussed more and more in India. So in answer to your question, which is a perfect question to start with, actually, it's not just colonialism, but specifically settler colonialism that is the defining feature of life in Palestine today. Across the entire territory of historical Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestinians have been subject to 8 decades of mass displacement, their villages and their houses demolished, their lands taken, either by the formation of the ethno-nationalist Jewish state of Israel or by settlements in the West Bank or by Israel's, as we know, every day we see the wanton destruction and the annihilation of the Gaza Strip. So Israel's laws apply across Israel, of course, and also across Palestine, because Israel occupies Palestine. These laws apply in the conventional colonial manner. So one law for Jewish Israelis, another law for everyone else. So this is what is called an apartheid regime. So it's not only characterized by literal walls and checkpoints and sieges and blockades that separate families from each other, separate families from their livelihoods and their basic needs, but it's also a legal system. So it's not just physical walls. It's a legal system that infiltrates every moment of daily life. So we have a clear demarcation between the life choices available to a Jewish citizen and a settler, in contrast with the oppressive regime applicable. What are the choices available? Not very few available to Palestinian citizens, refugees, and stateless persons. If you're lucky, your only choice is get out. Right? So the International Court of Justice and various other national and international courts and commissions have declared that Israel's human rights obligations under the main conventions, ICCPR, ICSCR, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so on, they apply, of course, to everyone within Israel. They also apply extraterritorially in the occupied territories, because Israel is exercising control over these territories as though they were Israel, right? So legally, it's pretty clear that Israel is obligated to provide equal rights across all of historical Palestine. But instead, it is doing this apartheid regime, which is, it's the same as what European colonial jurisdictional practices were, not in just colonial places, but also in semi-colonial territories. So, for example, in Israeli settlements in the West Bank, they're essentially governed as zones of exceptional privilege for Israelis within Palestine. And this was a common colonial practice, for instance, under British rule in India, where British interests and British bodies were protected by a much higher legal standard than those applicable to Indians in India. So apartheid as a legal system depends on these jurisdictional tools that are sometimes very blatant, but sometimes also very subtle. And Israel's ability to choose which tool to apply and selectively applying its laws to particular people and particular places allows for this very tactical exploitation of labor and resources in the West Bank when it needs to, for instance. And this was also something that happened under European colonialism. And we know that from the Indian experience with the British, that Israel can nurture and incorporate local elites into this transnational capitalist class that's incentivized to participate efficiently in globalized capitalism. So that way you undermine any resistance. And the corruption of the ruling elite across Israel and Palestine is well known. We have multiple cases against Prime Minister Netanyahu, against leaders of the Palestinian Authority, and so on. So on one level, there are some similarities, for example, with the colonialism that we know about the British in India. So you have these unequal legal regimes providing strong incentives for the colonized to collaborate with the colonizer, to access personal benefits, familial benefits, and protections. And as was the case with the British in India, the resistance is very strong in Palestine. But this is particularly remarkable in the Palestinian case because the resistance has managed to survive despite policies that for decades are not only colonial, but that are blatantly genocidal, right? So here we come to a marked difference between settler colonialism and the type of colonial practices in India. So where the British in India had some interest in exploiting the labor of the native population, right? Whereas if we look at the Israeli policies in Palestine, these efforts are quite half-hearted at best, because the assumption is, and you hear this with policymakers and lawmakers in Israel, Palestinian labor is not worth exploiting. And when you hear some of these policymakers talking about, Israeli policymakers talking about Palestinians, they don't compare them to beasts of burden, right? They don't compare them to donkeys or oxen. They compare them to cockroaches, right? Useless and only fit for extermination. That's the type of language that's used. So settler colonialism always ends up being this process of extreme annihilatory violence because the purpose is dispossession. Your land is now my land, go away, right? So that's the type of colonialism we're talking about.
Thank you so much, ma'am, on such an insightful answer on the Palestinian state that they are facing right now. Just a connected question to this. One of your central arguments is that Israel treats Palestine as both inside and outside its jurisdiction, depending upon their convenience. Sometimes as an enemy state, other times as an occupied territory. Why is this dual treatment problematic in law, and how does it reflect neo-colonial patterns in the region?
Okay, so, well, this is the main focus of my article, so I won't go into too much detail because obviously those who want the details can read the article. But broadly speaking, one cannot claim self-defense against a territory that one has already occupied. So this is not only common sense, but the International Court of Justice has also made this abundantly clear over the years, explicitly underlining that Israel cannot make the self-defense argument with regard to Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, given that Israel occupies all of Palestine. So, the last 2 years of annihilation that's been going on is Israel violating international law yet again, and it does it periodically. Right? Gaza is targeted periodically. Every few years this happens. Although this time, of course, the destruction is unlike anything we have seen before. Not just in Gaza, it's unlike anything we have seen before anywhere in the world. An unprecedented level of destruction, even when compared with the horrors of the Second World War. Right? And so, there we had carpet bombing and we had nuclear weapons used. This looks worse than that. So, in between these periodic attacks on the Gaza Strip, Israel, very much governs Palestine as an occupier, and it decides on every aspect of life inside these territories, what power is delegated there, who gets in, who gets out, what gets out, which legal regimes apply, and where they apply. And so, if we see a ceasefire holding this time, we will see this mode of governance now returning to the Gaza Strip. So, normally, if you control a territory as an occupier and there's violence emanating, this is supposed to be addressed through your police force because you are governing this territory, even though obviously it's illegal to take territory. While you're an occupier, there are laws that apply to you. And so, then you take targeted action towards the violent actors to stop the violence, rather than a wholesale armed attack against an entire population for 2 years after the attack has stopped, right? So Israel has this very singular understanding of how a border works, right? Elsewhere in the world, a border functions in two directions. It establishes two distinct sovereignties. And from whichever side you're on, the border is understood as functioning inward, delimiting one's own state's jurisdiction, and outward, preventing the intervention of the jurisdiction of others. But unlike any other border in the world, the Israeli border works in one direction only. Israel can penetrate the border, but it must not be penetrated, right? And if this happens, the resulting violence is extreme, even genocidal. So, we have, the Israeli human rights lawyer, Michael Tzfad, describing the barrier wall, the partition wall in the West Bank as having only one side. It only gives Israel an inside without having to recognize the area on the other side of the fence as outside because settlements are still going on there. So this one-way fence with sovereignty only on one side enables them to create moving lines of sovereignty. So the border is not a noun, it's not a place, it's a process, it's a verb. And the borders are constantly becoming, constantly moving. Right? And so we see this, for instance, with the changing buffer zones now being offered under the latest so-called peace plan. And the amount of buffer the Israeli military claims in the Gaza Strip not only continuously changes, but is also habitually transgressed by Israel in diverse ways. For instance, they spray herbicide to make sure plant cover is not too high so they can see into the strip. And that herbicide, of course, transgresses the fence and kills crops, kills farmlands on the other side. So Israel endeavors to normalize this uniquely flexible understanding of what a border means, that we're supposed to accept that this is normal, and tries to instead characterize any transgression in the other direction as really shocking and unjustifiable, right? So when common sense dictates that it's the other way around, that an occupier conducting a settler colonial project cannot be surprised when they encounter resistance.
on that, ma'am, I think you mentioned about the ceasefire, which and how the ceasefire might hold. But we often see that, like how you analyzed how Israel views borders very unidirectionally. Israel also has a very strong monopoly on violence and what violence is legitimized and not legitimized, especially with the ceasefire being broken quite a few times, even after it happened, like just a few days back. Carl Schmitt, a German jurist, which I had read up upon, had argued using the principle of jus publicum Europeum, where he called the colonial law as a European interstate colonial law, which forbids violence against each other but legitimizes violence against non-European states. Do you see Israel using violence in a very similar manner? And how do you see Israel monopolizing this violence as opposed to the resistance which, let's say, Hamas or Palestinians have against the apartheid state?
Okay, so I think you probably get some idea of what I'm about to say already from my answers so far. So, I mean, the colonizer needs the state of exception, the state of exclusion, the state of emergency. Is what we used to calling it in India, right? The place where the colonizer can not only practice exceptional violence, but against which the colonizer can justify and define itself. That there is this realm of lawlessness. So in this case, Palestine, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., or in our case, Kashmir, Manipur, Assam, Nagaland, Chhattisgarh, so on. But here we are in the realm of law, of democracy and human rights. So, the state of exception is not just about justifying the use of brute force and overwhelming violence in these places. They are lawless, so why should we apply the law to them? But, types of violence that are illegal in other parts of Israel and in other parts of India. But also the need to be able to live with yourself and justify your overwhelming violence, by proclaiming your own moral superiority. And to say this is in the cause of the greater good of democracy, human rights, and so on. So, I mean, how else can Israel justify slaughtering innocents, right? Such as newborns who are still in the ICU. Or how else do you justify starving children and elderly people to death? So you have to create this civilizational distinction, and it is actually quite useful for powerful people. They need to be able to justify at times the suspension of certain laws and protections for certain people and certain places within their territory, but also to selectively extend their laws and protections extraterritorially so they can go there and safely exploit the land and labor of others and protect the property that they've gained, right? So historically, the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction was not actually a common sense derivation from the concept of territory, which is what it sounds like, extraterritorial. But it was actually, the notion of extraterritorial jurisdiction was the product of attempts to selectively evade some territorially based laws and selectively employ other laws as needed. So it's not new, but.
So, you have written about how powerful states, especially the US, shield Israel through military aid, Security Council vetoes, and political cover, effectively influencing international law. Could you talk a little about how power operates in international law here, especially with the UNGA endorsing a two-state solution and the recent wave of Western countries recognizing Palestinian statehood?
Okay, so you're probably too young to know this, but we have had these recurring peace plans, and the two-state solution and these recurring peace plans that they're often offered every few decades, and they provide this. Essentially, we know from the past peace plans, they provide a facile cover for Israel's ongoing encroachment and settlements. And this is the Twail argument about international law, that liberal legalism provides a cloak for racial capitalism, right? That the sad thing is that, for me this time around, because I am old enough to remember the previous times, the sad thing is that in the past, I think there were some who genuinely believed peace and compromise was possible through plans and negotiations and so on. But today we live in a very different world. I think we live in a virtual reality where politicians and journalists say things, they just parrot these platitudes. No one actually believes them. They don't believe it. They know no one believes it. We don't believe them. We know they know that we don't believe them, but everyone is okay carrying on with life like that, and that is something that I think is unique to the post-90s, what's happened in globalized society. Now, this is very challenging in international law because it's a phenomenon that goes beyond this peace plan for Palestine. We actually see the same nonsense in other areas of international law. For instance, these annual climate conference of the parties, where we have them every year, and every year global emissions continue to increase. And we actually emitted more greenhouse gases in the 33 years since the climate treaty was written than in all of human history before the climate treaty was written. But yet we go through these motions without acknowledging that we are part and parcel of the very problems that we are claiming to solve. Indeed, we are at the very heart of the problem, which we obviously know when we see the leaders of the United States and Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia meeting. We know who is at the heart of this problem, and the Palestinians are not there, mind you. So that is what we have with these Western powers that now come to the UN General Assembly, vote for Palestine and peace and statehood. That day they do it in September every year, but the rest of the year they continue to fund Israel, continue to fund its military. And this includes the Indian government also, and Indian corporations that do this, continue to promote its economy and participate in its economy, participate in academic exchanges, work with its universities, give it grants, support its journalists. The entire apparatus of genocide and settler colonialism is supported by Western powers and also by powers in the global South. And this is why I think it's great that you're talking about this in India, because, I think we can do better. I don't have much expectations of the West, but I have expectations of India. So, liberal international law is actually a more dangerous discourse, because this type of liberal imperialism is actually harder to confront than the naked exercise of absolute power by authoritarians, right? So I think that, that it's a good question. And that's, we need to you think about why exactly people bother with these exercises when nobody believes them anymore. What's the value that's being gained?
Ma'am, you very interestingly mentioned about how even though it's a genocide, the West continues to be complicit. A lot of the global South also continues to be complicit. However, we have failed to come to an official recognition of there being a genocide, because even I think in the past month there were claims of Google allowing misinformation that the Israeli embassy floating around videos that there is food in Palestine, even though the United Nations had pointed out that there's a famine going on. How do we as students trying to enter into academia, and you as a scholar who's present in academia, deal with this sort of misinformation which goes around and propaganda which comes around when a genocide happens?
Well, the media and academia play a key role in any imperial project, and that's been the case always. Even millennia ago, you see this. And, as I mentioned earlier, these are not projects of just sole brute force. They're also taking control of knowledge production, of epistemologies, of history, of discourse, of narrative. Who gets to shape the story and who is systemically silenced? So one of the reasons why during this genocide, it's somewhat hard to argue that we don't know what's going on is because there were those who were dedicated to televising what was happening in the Gaza Strip. Some of them were those who were inflicting the violence there because they were proud of what they were doing, and they were televising it for that reason. And then there were also those who were on the receiving end, who were broadcasting at great personal risk, many of whom have sacrificed their lives so that we can know the truth, right? So I've lost 2 of my students and 2 of my colleagues in this indiscriminate slaughter over the last, and that's what I know of. It's not actually easy to communicate with colleagues over the last 2 years. Every university has been razed to the ground quite early in the conflict, right? So we can't generalize about what academics are facing and what they're doing, what journalists are facing and what they're doing. But I've been in academia for 20 years now, working across all sorts of countries: Indonesia, China, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, United States, and now in Jamaica. And there are, of course, always some research findings that are risky, right? That you can face. If you're lucky, you can get fired or you can be ostracized by your colleagues. But if you're not lucky, then you can face deportation, imprisonment, disappearance, or much worse than that. And the Palestine exception is on top of the list of what academia will not tolerate. And this is more obvious in the global north, for instance, in the United States, but it infiltrates everywhere, given how globalized academic influence is, right? This very article that you're talking about, which I was invited to write by the National Law School of India Review, it's a special issue in honor of my mentor, the great Indian legal scholar B.S. Chimney. But the US guest editor refused to publish my article once they realized it was about Palestine. And it was only due to the staunch advocacy of the Indian guest editor that my article was ultimately included. So, and you don't need me to tell you about what's happening in Indian academia on other issues, right? So, or in Egyptian academia, in Turkish academia. So this is a phenomenon that is on the rise all over the world. So for me, it is an indication that what we say and what we do as scholars matters deeply, right? Because most of the time, academics are thought of as ivory tower, useless, theoretical, analytical people. Well, then why bother silencing us? So what we say and what we do matters deeply. We are part of these systems, and the universities are part of the institutionalized violence of the state, the institutionalized violence of the society, and the oppression. And we're not immune from this. So if there's a racial or gender-based violence in society, it's also in the university. The university is part of society, right? And so we have a responsibility to stand up for what is important to us as legal scholars. As legal scholars, what is important to us usually is truth and justice. And also what is important to us as people, kindness and decency and love and care for our whole community and all its members, remembering that, we are all connected, that none of us can keep ourselves separate, however hard we might try to build walls, real walls, legal walls, metaphorical boundaries. The human community is indivisible. And I mean, climate change is the extreme example of this. But even before we knew about climate change, whatever we do to other people, in the end, whether we like it or not, we are doing it to ourselves.
We are running short of time, so we'd like to wrap the podcast with the question. As you mentioned that about a personal loss that you lost two students in the violence, which indeed shows that there are often situations of despair in such scenarios. As students of international law, we often feel torn between optimism and despair. From your perspective, what role can young people, especially from the global south, play in reshaping international law towards more just and fair ends?
So that's perfect. Last question. And there's absolutely no need for despair. I feel that Eurocentric international law and Eurocentric international institutions, as they stand today, cannot actually be reformed and reshaped towards more just ends. I don't think that's possible. But I don't think that that's cause for despair, because there can be a new international law, and there should be a new international law, one that's actually fit for the purpose of the diverse global challenges that we have today. I mean, some of the issues that local and national communities face today require at least some degree of international cooperation, right? There's no avoiding this. Issues such as large-scale environmental change and mass migration and all the health issues like pandemic, they're better managed if nations engage in some degree of cooperation at least. So it is possible to imagine a genuinely international law informed by ideals and concepts and languages all over the world. And, maybe it should be fairly minimal and leave lots of room for diversity and hybridity and localities. But even in the existing Eurocentric international law, we see through the notion of general principles of law that there are certain basic commonalities that everyone in every legal system understands. When you harm someone, you should make reparation and you should stop doing the harms, right? There are some things that are actually common to all legal systems in the world. And then on top of this, we have certain communities who have experience with the problems the whole world is facing, experience with sustainable living, experience with how to make a peace that actually lasts, how to reconcile and repair their communities. So these communities should be allowed to share their legal systems, their legal traditions, their knowledge on their own terms and in their own languages without having to translate it through the medium of Eurocentric laws and ideas. Those, and also those who are at the receiving ends of the harms, should be allowed to speak directly to what they need from laws and institutions and what these laws should look like. Instead, we have a system that's the complete opposite, right? We have those with a proven track record of failure, creating wars, creating inequality, creating exploitation, creating ecological catastrophe. Those are the people who are calling themselves experts in peace and economy and labor and environment, and engaging in international lawmaking in these, massive televised forums. Whereas those who live sustainably with nature and with each other are subject to not just silencing, they're subject to systemic erasure and genocide, right? I'm thinking here of the fate of indigenous and tribal communities all over the world, including in India. So, I think there are many sources of hope all around us in our local communities, including in the universities and in the transnational solidarities and social movements for change, because what I'm saying, a lot of people know, right? And we've been building these solidarities for decades. So to students, I always say, first of all, find your joy, find the thing that makes you happy to your soul, that you would do even if no one paid you to do it, and in my case, that's learning and teaching, but that's different for every person. And don't let anyone tell you that your joy is wrong or inappropriate. It's your joy, and then find your people, those who share your commitments, and then you'll find your hope and you'll not despair, because despair is very close nowadays. I understand what you mean. And as you said, I myself have had to struggle with this over the last 2 years. But the way you get through it is that you can't do this kind of work alone. You need your friends, you need your allies, not only to achieve your goals and to survive the pushback, because if you do a good job, you will be pushed back, because there are going to be people who don't want you to exist, right? But more importantly, to make this fun for you and stave off these inevitable moments of like cynicism. Cynicism is even worse than despair, right? And to remember why you're doing this, who you're doing this for. You need a community, right? So that's my advice.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It is pretty important, especially in the times we're living in. I do think solidarity is needed not only in a personal level, like you mentioned, but also in an international level. And I think that is a very good ending theme for this podcast as well, because it does wrap up pretty well in terms of, it was a very informative and interesting podcast in terms of understanding how these power structures exist and how these structures are so lopsided. And we also see how a country is given so much free reign in allowing to use and monopolize these lopsided structures, and how there's such little interference or help from the West. But I think the segue into what we had into our conversation in terms of what people of the global South are expected to do, and the expectation we have in terms of how we can challenge these narratives and how we can look to having a newer and a better and a more just legal order, and what we, not only as possible or hopeful academicians, but also students of law, can do. I think this is a pretty important conversation which we were supposed to have, because Palestine needs to be talked about more, even though it is, I think it's very hopeful to see how there have been multiple protests in light of the flotilla and the ceasing of the flotilla, and it has become a much more easier conversation to have now. But like you mentioned, it's a conversation we need to continue having, and we are glad to have hosted you for this conversation. It outside of on an academic level, it was a pleasure to talk to you. You are a great person to talk to, and it was a lovely conversation to have. And we hope to keep this relationship.
It was a pleasure to talk to the three of you as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We hope to keep this relationship with ILPS standing forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.